Hope you had a great lunch and restful. So we are going to kick off the afternoon with the talk of Gordon Pennycook. The floor is yours.
Thanks. As you'll see, they correctly intuited that I would be incomprehensible. They put subtitles up. They won't slow down the rate at which I speak, but I'm going to try to go slower given that there are. Okay, so I was unsure about how to start the talk. I had three different ways to start it. Well, what I decided to do was just do all three of them. So it's going to be a start and a stop sort of thing, but see why I'm doing it when I do it. So part of this talk is to make a pitch actually for placing the field of reasoning more in the center of people's everyday understanding about why they make mistakes. I think there are lots of ways that we could apply the theories and the knowledge that we gain from the field of reasoning to a much broader set of phenomena in the world. Okay. And so this is included. The last is psychology means for promoting human welfare. This is a classic speech from, and also subsequently a paper from George Miller, who was the APS president at the time, or the APA president. He said, the most urgent problems of our world today are the problems we've made for ourselves. They are human problems whose solutions require us to change our behavior in our social institutions. Now, I don't know what George would say now. I think that now this is not just reasoning, but the field of psychology in general. It totally makes sense that if we think about the major problems that we're facing, they are the result of decision making, our own decision making, our own reasoning. To what extent has our research actually improved things? Not as much as it ought to, I would say. My own kind of attempt to work at this problem is I'm focused on reasoning errors. And the reason that I'm focused on errors is because if we can figure out what the mistakes are, then we can maybe figure out some solutions to avoid them. That's the basic logic. Okay. So that's beginning number one. It's about the problems. And we think about global warming, misinformation, political sectarianism, the rise of gas prices. Although that's more like maybe one person's decision, so it's a little bit different. But anyways, these are our own choices that kind of contribute to these mistakes, these problems. Okay, start number two. What I'm going to do in this slide is just outline, in summary, my own perspective on why I think we make mistakes during reasoning. Okay, and this is actually, partly because I have so many of my colleagues in the room. I just want to lay out clearly just my own perspective, and I'm going to mostly talk about elements of this throughout the talk. So here's my grand theory of everything. The first is the basic idea that we rely too much on our intuitions and we sometimes fail to reflect. Okay, and as Val said, sometimes we reflect too much. But in general, I think a lot of the mistakes that we make are the consequence of just not thinking things through. Okay, and that's a kind of a generic dual process kind of idea. Importantly, I think that this often occurs, maybe most often occurs, because people don't realize that they need to reflect. They haven't realized that they're facing a problem that needs more thought. It's not that they're engaging in something that you might call motivated reasoning, that it's a metacognition problem. This is what Val was talking about in terms of monitoring. They're overconfident. They don't recognize there's some sort of conflict. This is what Wim was talking about. There's something that didn't trigger them to realize they need to stop and think about something. Okay. It is the case, though, that sometimes people make mistakes in a more kind of motivational way. They engage in rationalization. Janie talked about this, or what you might call motivated reasoning. But my argument is that this is actually pretty rare. And that's what actually mostly I'm going to be talking about in this talk. And the reason that I think it's rare is because I don't think it makes much sense evolutionarily for us to evolve the system that requires effort, but that leads to essentially self-delusion. Okay, I think it is the case that people may sometimes engage in deliberation in a way that really shoots themselves in the foot, but mostly they're just not thinking enough. Not that they're thinking too much in the wrong direction. Okay, and the final thing is that to understand all these different things, we really need to think about individual differences. Okay, and I'll talk about that. And I'm gonna kind of make that a little bit shorter because Maggie's going to talk about that next as well. Okay, that was start number two. Start number three. And this is the real start. this is now a little bit of a story. So I grew up in a small town in rural Saskatchewan called Carrot River. Okay. And this is where it is on the map. You can see it's sufficiently in the middle of nowhere. If you go north of where I grew up, it's mostly just trees. There aren't really any towns. There's a few reserves up there. And the reason that this is relevant is because it's 1,000 people in the town. For most of my life when I was a kid, I thought that I was the only person that had a certain set of beliefs. I stopped believing in God when I was in whatever grade it was. I was in middle school, or I would have been. That's right. I'm now in America. I wasn't actually middle school. We didn't have a middle school in Carrot River. We had one school in Carrot River. In any case, I was in grade 6 or whatever it was. And so my experience was different. I was like, no one else thinks the things that I think. And that was what really drove me to be interested in the nature of people's beliefs. The reason I bring this up is because I started the talk saying the reason why it makes sense to focus on how we apply our theories to the real world is because we can provide some benefit. That's not actually what happened. What actually happened was I was interested in like religion. Oh yeah, this is the small town. There it is. That's where I grew up. If the wind's blowing the wrong direction, you can smell the cows. Okay. And so let's fast forward a little bit to 2009. Val's in the audience. She was my undergrad honors thesis supervisor. She's the one who plucked me from obscurity and set me down this path. But actually what happened was I was taking a class with the late great Jamie Campbell. And he pulled me aside. He said, hey, you should apply for this undergrad summer research award. And I was like, well, I'm interested in like doing psychology of religion. And then he was like, oh, well, Val does research on reasoning. That's kind of the same thing. And at the time I thought, oh, okay, well, whatever. I didn't know that he was married to Val. And I was getting into the lab. And I got lucky, and that's how I got. And if he didn't have that conversation, I wouldn't be here. But the real reason that I bring this up is because he was right. And I'll come back to that too. Okay. So when I joined the lab with Val, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but I became steeped in this idea of dual processes, of understanding the nature of our thinking through the lens of, intuition versus reason. And people have talked about it sufficiently. I don't need to go through the details of this. Here's the core implication of this work from my understanding. Intuitions are often wrong, and we need to engage in analytic thinking to correct them. That is the basic idea, the core way that the perspective I would take from that work and throw on top of everything that I was thinking about outside of that. Okay. As time passed, I came to realize, and perhaps the field did as well, or whatever. Maybe this was just youthful understanding of a more complicated problem. That it's not the case that our intuitions are often wrong. Actually, our intuitions are often right. They're probably more often right than they're wrong. Wim talked about that as well. And so that's research on expertise. Gerger answers on work on heuristics. The more recent stuff that Wim was talking about, how we can say, I'm not going to say logical intuitions. We'll call them intuitions that approximate logic. A better label, perhaps. And so what we have to change this implication, but I don't think we have to change it in a way that's really that meaningfully different. It's that our intuitions are sometimes wrong, and we sometimes need to engage in reflection to correct them. To me, that's essentially the same thing. I think it's an important correction, but the implication there is that reflection is the thing that you do to be more accurate in the world, to be more rational. Okay. I'm now in a social psychology area at Cornell, which was unfathomable to me when I was in grad school and undergrad. But I'm a social psychologist, sort of. I'm both a cognitive and social psychologist. And what I came to understand as I kept on reading more stuff outside of the field was there's a completely different perspective on reasoning outside of cognitive psychology, and primarily in social psychology. And that is, stuff from Jonathan Haidt, Eric Gulansky, Dan Kahan, all these people. They argue actually that deliberation is rarely corrective. And when I say rarely corrective, I don't mean in the way that Wim is talking about, where often our intuitions are accurate and therefore it doesn't need to be corrective. What they're saying is that deliberation is rarely corrective because people don't deliberate when they have strong intuitions. And even if they did, what deliberation would do is only reinforce the thing that they want to believe in the first place, particularly in consequential cases where ideology is relevant and so on. And so we cannot expect our deliberation to actually be corrective. I'll give you an explicit example of this, a classic example from Jonathan Haidt. back before he was saving the world from smartphones. He was writing psychology papers. And this is a very kind of like famous, still very influential kind of model. And so I think summarizes essentially the way that social psychologists approach reasoning. He says that intuitions lead directly to judgment, and then reasoning comes after. Okay, A here is person A. Okay, the function of reasoning, the primary function of reasoning in Jonathan Haidt's model is to convince other people that you're right, to influence person B's intuitions. And then this is the whatever, that's the cycle that you go through. He does, of course, have these little dotted lines. Of course, the dotted lines are restricted to Jonathan Haidt and his friends, basically. He says, the reason judgment, like where reasoning influences your judgment, is hypothesized to be rare, occurring primarily in cases in which the initial intuition is weak and processing capacity is high. So that doesn't happen very often in cases that we care about. And he says, rational models focus on links 5 and 6. This is what I think of as the kind of core of what reasoning is. He thinks that these things are rare. The social intuitions model, in contrast, moral judgment, and then the paper is about moral judgment, but it's applied broadly, consists primarily of links 1 to 4, although the model allows that links 5 and 6 may sometimes contribute, sometimes, okay, for philosophers or for Jonathan Haidt. I think he's wrong. How about that? Okay, and I'm going to use most of the talk to explain why I think he's wrong and what the data indicate. So here's to put the two ideas side by side, just so that we're clear what we're talking about here. I'm going to call the kind of Haidt perspective intuitionism. That is the idea that our intuitions determine most of our judgments, which I think is actually everyone generally agrees upon. But more importantly, that reasoning plays a small role in determining our beliefs and behaviors. And when it does play a role, it's just to reinforce our intuitions. That's why I'm calling it intuitionism. Okay. An implication of this idea is that if we have the reasoning tests that we all use, where people are engaging in reasoning, they shouldn't actually matter. We can get people to reason if we give them a problem. If they're out in the world and you're talking about beliefs that matter or a moral judgment they're making, those differences are not relevant because reasoning doesn't really play a role when the stakes are high. It's not important. Okay, that's the implication of their argument based on my own reasoning about it. I'm going to say my own perspective is this. Intuitions are a key source of errors, but of course they're not the whole story. We have reasoning for a reason. We can override our intuitions. That's what Stanovich calls decoupling. It's a real thing that happens. And when people are thinking deliberately, rationalization is not the characteristic path. And when I say this, I mean like they're substantively engaging deliberation. I mean, of course, there's like remedial forms that would go down the path of rationalization, but it's not characteristic. And certainly it's not characteristic of errors. The errors occur because of intuitions, not because of rationalization. Okay. And therefore, if we can measure simply whether people are more disposed to think analytically, that should have broad consequences for lots of different things. Okay. And so now what I'm going to do is just in a few slides say that it does have lots of consequences for many different things. And then I'll go on to some newer research. So here's the bat and ball problem. Everyone has now been exposed to this. A bat and ball costs $1 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? I see if that's okay. Yeah, that was pretty good. I can do it like an auctioneer because I've said it so many times. And so people say 10 cents, but the correct answer is 5 cents. I don't need to go into the logic of this. But I think one important addendum here. I think there was a simplistic view of this problem, which is that when people get it, they have to reflect and override the intuition. And that's why it's a good measure of analytic thinking. I think that's partly true. It's also partly a good measure of analytic thinking because people who get it right, even if they get it right intuitively or they avoid the intuitive response, in order to do that, they had to, before the experiment, engage in lots of reflection to be good at math. And so it ends up being a good measure of reflection, even if it's not reflection in that literal moment. But based on all these different studies, it's a pretty good measure, simple measure of just whether people are someone who's likely to be thinking analytically about problems. Okay. And all the things I'm going to list, you could predict them using only that one problem. Of course, we use lots of different things. We have a battery of tests. We use the cognitive reflection test. We have heuristics biases test. You can give people belief bias syllogisms. You can give them base rate problems. You can give them questionnaires that measured analytic thinking. Lots of different ways to measure all these things. And they all point in the same direction. That is, people who are more reflective are less likely to believe what you might call euphemistically epistemically suspect beliefs. These are things for which there is a kind of weak evidence to support. And that makes sense that people who are more reflective and thinking more about things believe them less. So superstitious beliefs, alternative medicine, go down the list, and you can probably come up with something right now that you think, and if you had a good justification for it to be epistemically suspect, there's probably a study on it. And these are just the ones that I've done, but there's many, many, many more studies that are on this topic, including on the topic of bullshit, which I wish I had time to talk about, but I don't. But you can check out the paper. I have a picture of my grandma holding up the paper it's called On the Reception and Detection of Pseudo-Profound Bullshit, and that's one of my prouder moments. But the one I'll talk about more substantively is what I opened with, what I was interested initially with is religious disbelief. And so Jamie was right. Reasoning does relate to people's religious beliefs, but more so for some people than others. Okay, and so here's an example of a study that more new one. So in this study, we have a gigantic sample of people. This is the number of people. So there's 3,000 people here, and there's two groups. We asked them, which of these categories do you fit into? Of course, we don't use the terms. We have like sentences. They believe in a God. They're not really sure. They don't know, and no one else does. That's agnostic, and then they believe that God does not exist. Okay, or they don't believe in God. That's what atheist is. And this is their score in the CRT. So people who are more reflective are less likely to believe in God. Okay, that's the basic pattern. And that was a paper we published way back in 2012. I ran that study in my first year of grad school. However, what we also did is, okay, so if you fit this category, have you ever been in a different category at some point in your life? Okay, so all the people here are people that, if they're an atheist, they've always been an atheist. Probably their parents weren't religious. Here, these are people who are theists, and they've always been theists. But there are some people who are atheists who used to be theists. Then there are people who are agnostic and whatever. And those are people who had changed their belief. And we posit probably because they were reflecting on it. And they're more reflective people. And that is what you find. And the interesting pattern here is not just that people who had changed their belief are more reflective, which maybe is in a certain sense kind of obvious. It's true even for the theists. These are people who became more religious. They were apathetic. Usually, in most of the categories is that they're apathetic, and then they, at some point in their life, became more religious. Those theists are more reflective than the theists who have always been theists. Yeah. No, this is a primary Christian sample, but yeah. Yeah. Okay. And another example of how reflective thinking is important. I think this is one of the most consequential individual differences that we can ask about. And people always ask about like personality traits. They don't predict any of these things hardly at all. Okay, not the things that I care about. They predict other things, but not the things that I care about. So here's another thing that's important. So what we did is we have people who were Twitter users back when it was called Twitter, and I'm not going to call it X. It's the stupidest name for a website, but whatever. And we had them do the CRT. But then we also got their behavior on Twitter. We know what they were tweeting, what they were on social media. Okay. And then what we have is a database of fact checker ratings for the quality of news sources. Okay. So a higher rating means it's a higher quality source. Okay. So the BBC is a better source than the Daily Mail. Okay. And what you find is that people who are more reflective, they score higher on the CRT, are sharing more content the size is the amount of links, more content from higher quality sources. People who are more intuitive are sharing more stuff from the Daily Mail. All the British people will know this is a complete rag. No one should read the Daily Mail. No Daily News, Fox News, these are not good news sources. And so they're engaging more rationally in the world in the same sort of way that would be expected if these things matter. Also, this is a bit of a side note. You also see homophilies. Homophily is like attracts like. What you have here is not different networks based on what people think, but how they think. These are the high CRT people. They're in a different network on Twitter than the low CRT people. What you see over here are people are following and retweeting celebrities. There's scams on Twitter, stuff like that. Here you see science, actually comedy. You see like Jon Stewart, Daily Show, stuff like that. More of that over here. Okay. So they're existing on a different sort of social media. And it's a function of, or at least related to, the nature of the way they think about things. Okay, not just problems, but how they engage on social media. So there's a check mark. Okay, I'm giving myself credit for being right about that. But that doesn't go quite far enough. So there's another perspective on reasoning errors that goes even further down the path of reasoning is not just infirm, but actually backfires, is work from Dan Kahan. He calls it identity protective cognition. He says that reasoning, in cases in which there is some sort of threat to your identity, you will use your reasoning to protect your identity and not to figure out the truth. Okay, and being a better, more reflective thinker will therefore facilitate bias. So it's the opposite of all the things that we would think. Okay, and this is not an uncommon idea. Here's from the Heterodox Academy. It says being smart is no protection against bias. Highly intelligent, educated people may, in many respects, actually be more prone to dogmatism and motivated reasoning than most. In many respects, is doing a lot of work in that sentence, but it's also almost certainly wrong. It's certainly wrong-headed. Being intelligent and educated is good. I'm here to assure you. But here's one of the patterns of results that has like really driven a lot of the theorizing in this space, and I think can be explained more simply than people do. So sorry, it's included, but it's whether people believe that humans are causing climate change. Okay, and this is again, how reflective are you? Higher score, more reflective; lower score, more intuitive. And what you find is this weird pattern among Democrats. If you're better at reasoning, you're more likely to agree with the scientists about global warming than if you're a more intuitive Democrat, which is the pattern that everyone would expect. They're being more reflective means you're kind of more accurate if you assume that scientists know what they're talking about, which I do. However, and here's the key pattern, for Republicans, it's the opposite. The Republicans who are better at reasoning are more likely to disagree with the scientists about global warming. Okay, now I don't have it in the slides because I didn't have time. We know that this pattern is only, by the way, true for global warming. You can ask about nuclear power, Big Bang, all these different other types of things. You don't see this pattern. It's only true for global warming. And by the way, it's probably because global warming has been so obscured by millions of dollars of funding, creating false expertise and disinformation, that even the smartest Republicans aren't sorting. And I mean, it's true for the Democrats. This is signaling. And so the key pattern here, in any case, based on the logic, is that the reason that this happens is because the smarter Republicans are doing more work to convince themselves what they want to believe is true. And that's true for the Democrats too. Okay, but there's a negative correlation between being reflective and essentially kind of accuracy. And what I'm going to tell you now, this is put it side by side. Identity protective cognition argues that errors occur because people conform assessments of information to goals extrinsic to accuracy. It's not about the truth, it's about protecting your identity or whatever. And reasoning actively facilitates this. Okay, and therefore you should find cases where if there's a motivation, reasoning is associated with an accuracy. Okay, whereas I would say errors occur because people don't sufficiently reason. It's the opposite, actually. And when reasoning occurs, it generally facilitates accuracy. The more time you spend reasoning, generally that it doesn't say it's always the case, but it's generally a good thing. Okay. By the way, this is not insignificant. If we want to like think about how we would recommend to people to approach problems in this world, we're all in major trouble. Because all the stuff that we do to try to educate people, to encourage them to be reflective, it might actually be facilitating errors. I mean, fortunately, I think it's wrong, but it would be a problem if that was. So there's a bunch of different things I could talk about in this context, and I encourage you, I'll put a slide up with the reviews. It basically cannot find evidence for that idea that reasoning facilitates inaccuracy. It's extremely hard to find evidence, but I'm going to give you one example from the context of misinformation and fake news. Because it was, by the way, when it first happened, when Trump got elected the first time and fake news became a big story, the most prominent explanation for that was partisanship was driving it. That people were just convincing themselves that these fake stories were true because they wanted them to be true. And not because they're distracted, they're not thinking that much, they have individual intuitive biases. It was because of motivation. Okay. And so in these studies, what we do is we give people actual examples of true and false news headlines. These ones are both false. You can see they're kind of dated. And you'll notice that, like if you think it's a sort of situation where you can see why they were constructed. This one, like obviously trying to take advantage of people not liking Obama. But you have to stop and think for a second. Why would his daughters want to live in Russia? It doesn't make that much sense if you stop and think about it for a little bit. Okay. If you're interested in how we do these studies, we have I wrote this kind of guide that I think is generally helpful for students who are getting into it. So how you get the materials, all that kind of stuff. All right. But obviously show you the basic finding. It's pretty straightforward. So we have news headlines that are politically consistent. They're pro-democratic, and that's a Democrat who's making the judgment, or a Republican is a pro-Republican headline, or they're inconsistent, which is just vice versa. Okay. And here's the prediction from the motivated reasoning perspective, right? That as reasoning increases, as your capacity to reason increases, so too will the amount of bias. That is, if you're better at reasoning, you're better at convincing yourself that things that you want to be true are true. That's consistent, so it's a positive correlation. But you're also better at convincing yourselves that things that you don't want to be true are not true. And so it's a negative correlation, right? And you'll notice it's the same pattern as you see for global warming. So we're just taking that and imputing it onto this context of fake news. Okay? That's what the expectation is. And this is the reality. What you find is that people who are more reflective are less likely to believe false headlines. And I mean, there's a main effect here. People believe the stuff that's consistent with their ideology more than the stuff that's inconsistent. So there's like a political bias. It is completely unrelated to how reflective they are. Okay. So what's happening essentially is that being a reflective person better calibrates your judgments to reality. It doesn't mean that you don't have a bias, but the bias is an intuitive bias, right? And it's not being exacerbated by how much they're thinking. Okay. You also see the kind of opposite pattern, but it's weaker for belief in true news, and I'm going to explain why that's the case, why it's weaker in a second. In fact, this very second. Okay, so this is now including the key. I'm going to move this very slightly. Okay, because this is a little bit complicated. Hopefully I can do this. Okay. So this is plausibilities. What we have here is the headlines are rated out of sample by a different group of people on how plausible they seem. Okay, so you have news headlines that are very obviously true, which would be like a hurricane happened and it happened or something like that. And there's ones that are very, very obviously not true. They're like maybe I think the Obama's daughters living in Russia is like a pretty implausible fake news headline, for example. But then you have ones in the middle where it's unclear. I could make a headline right now. Trump had a hamburger for breakfast. I just made that up, but it sounds like something that could be true. Impossible to verify. Who's to say? Okay. And what you find is, and so what I'm plotting here is the extent to which for that item, and each dot or triangle is going to be an item, a fake news headline, how much belief in that item is related to how reflective they are. Okay, so let me try to explain this. Oh, okay, I clicked on the thing. Okay, so it's an extremely high correspondence between the underlying plausibility of the headline and the extent to which the CRT correlates with it. And so it's pretty straightforward, actually. Here you have ambiguous cases. And often these are true, but some of them are false, where it's unclear whether they're true or false. And being reflective doesn't help in that situation. Doesn't matter how much you stop and think about a headline, the Trump hamburger thing. I mean, who's to say? I don't know. It's hard to say. So in those cases, being reflective is not predictive of what people judge. Here, these are ones that are discernible as false. These are things that are false. Plausibly, they're implausible headlines. And so if you believe those, then you're pretty intuitive. If you are reflective, you reject them. Okay? And then here are the things that are discernible as true. And now the reason why there's a weaker correlation for true headlines and false ones is that it's cut off here. We don't have headlines. We never, just by virtue of the way that we did these studies, we never put obviously true headlines in the studies because it wasn't game enough. It wasn't like, it was too easy to do. And so we just have cut off this part of the distribution. But anyways, it's the same, it's just a parallel pattern from the bottom. If you are reflective, then you're better identifying things that are like legitimately true when you have reasons to believe. Okay, but this is just a fancy way of saying being reflective just calibrates your judgments to reality. Okay. And this is just our proxy for reality. Okay. And so what you find is that people who are more reflective are better at distinguishing between what's true and false. It doesn't matter if it's consistent with their ideology or inconsistent. Okay. We also did an experiment where we did the two response paradigm. And we have both true and false news headlines, and they're politically consistent and inconsistent. Okay, again, if reflection increases bias, forcing people to go quickly and then giving them the opportunity to reflect should increase bias. Once they think more, they should be more biased, and that's not what you find. You find the opposite, or like essentially, it doesn't matter whether it's consistent or inconsistent. If you force them to go fast, they believe fake news more. If you let them slow down, they believe it less. And that effect is exactly equivalent, essentially exactly equivalent, whether it's consistent with their ideology or inconsistent. Okay, so it's not politics that's explaining error, it's reflection. Now, to some extent, there is still, again, there's a bias. People believe the stuff that's consistent with their ideology more than inconsistent, but it's an intuitive bias, not a reflective one. Okay. All right. And we also did a study. This is all, in the context of US politics, which I think is the place where it makes the most sense to talk about misinformation, quite frankly. But misinformation is a problem everywhere. And so during COVID, that was a case in which the things that were false everywhere, and they were relevant everywhere, often to the same degree. And so we ran an experiment with the same underlying claims, of course, translated in 16 different countries across all the continents, except for Antarctica. We didn't get any penguins to do it, but so we have, in this case, this is just, again, CRT, true versus false news. In every single country, we found the same pattern. People who are more reflective are better able to distinguish between what's true and false in all the countries. Okay, so pretty good evidence there, I think, as well. Okay, so I think that warrants a check mark. It's pretty hard to find evidence for this, and we've done lots of different studies, and trust me, it's hard to find evidence for when reflective people make more mistakes. They don't very often. Generally thinking is good. Congratulations. Okay. Now, I want to slightly change gears here because there's a kind of a broader take, an even broader take. You can tell that I obviously like to focus on like the kind of broad level of these sorts of theories and how they are consequential. Another version of this idea that comes from social psychology, I think, has been adopted broadly, and that is the idea that we live in a post-truth society. There's a version of that argument that I think is fine, and that is that we live in a post-truth society insofar as that's more difficult to figure out what's true because of the media atmosphere, the spread of misinformation, etc. I think that's fine. There's a different version of the argument that I think is wrong, though, and that is that people don't care about the truth anymore. That for the same reason that I talked about, because of motivational context, ideology, all these things, the truth doesn't matter because people don't care. And I think that's wrong too. Okay. And there's lots of different things that I could talk about that relate to this. I'm just going to focus on one study, and it relates to conspiracies. And so just to make that things a little bit more concrete, the question is straightforward. How much do facts actually matter? Okay. And a simple way to translate this is it the case that people reliably update their beliefs according to evidence? Now, the addendum here, which is kind of obvious, is that in context in which they don't want to. Okay. Like obviously people update their views when you give them an appraisal for a house or something like that. I'm saying in a political context, when there are stakes, are people actually going to update their views as much as they ought to? Well, I would say as much as they ought to, but just at all, actually. Okay. So as a test case for this, we're going to talk about conspiracies, and then Meg is going to pick up on this. So the reason why we talk about conspiracies is because they're like a paradigmatic example of where evidence is thought to be irrelevant. The theories are kind of zany. They are looked down upon by most people. And if the only way that you could possibly believe a conspiracy is that you don't care about the truth. And in fact, the people talk about conspiracies as deliberation literally gone awry, that you spend all this time constructing this wild theory, as Charlie is here, and using reasoning to kind of come to the false conclusion. And in fact, the literature on conspiracy theories, the dominant view is that conspiracies are driven by needs and motivations. the need to belong, the need to feel control, the need to feel unique. It's everything, lots of needs, a bunch of different needs. And so in a certain sense, conspiracies are kind of functional. Okay. They don't argue that they actually fulfill those needs, but they are seen to fulfill the needs by the person. And that's why they have them. Okay. It's not because they're exposed to misinformation. It's not because they kind of fall down the rabbit hole. They're walking down the rabbit hole willingly. That's the idea. Okay. And it's the dominant view. I think there's an alternative to that, and it's partly driven by the common experience that people have. It's usually a relative, often an uncle. They believe wild things. You try to have a conversation with them, and they don't just change their mind within 30 seconds of you telling them that they're wrong. And so, well, they must not care about the truth. They don't listen to me. I gave them a good argument. But there's an alternative, I think. And it might be that, and just to simplify, you're not giving them a good enough argument. If you've ever had, and if you've done this many times, you'll notice that people who believe in conspiracies believe in a wildly different set of conspiracies. Even people who believe the same conspiracy may believe hugely different versions of it, and for lots of different reasons. Okay? If you want to actually effectively debunk these sorts of things, you have to have access to a huge amount of information to do it effectively. And there's lots of studies that people have done trying to debunk conspiracies. What the psychologist has to do in order to get that right is guess what the relevant conspiracy is that they believe in, get the wording right when they're asking about it, guess what the reasons are the person has to believe it, get a proper debunking of what those reasons are, and then do that for a sample of people. And lo and behold, they haven't done it effectively. Okay? And so if we look at the research on debunking conspiracies, it's like, oh, look, it's pretty infirm, therefore they don't care about the truth. I think that's wrong. Okay. And so here's what we did in this experiment. We call it Debunk Bot. We used AI to solve the problem. AI is very good at debunking conspiracies. And as I'll show you, it can also convince people to believe them, but it's also good at debunking them. It gives very good reasons why people shouldn't believe them. And so here's the experiment. We've integrated AI into Qualtrics, into our survey software. So we have a virtual RA in the study. By the way, you can do lots of things with that. You can generate materials on the fly. It's a great thing. Nice. And so the person unique to the study is, we don't guess what the conspiracy they believe in. They describe a conspiracy in their own words. Of course, we don't call it a conspiracy. We give it a definition. We say some people call these conspiracy theories, and then they write something up. Okay. So, by the way, what's going to happen is they're going to be like blocks of text that I'm not going to give you enough time to read. I'm just going to summarize them. Okay. I don't have time for you to read big blocks of text. But anyways, this person thinks that 9/11 was an inside job. And as an illustration of how idiosyncratic conspiracy beliefs are, or can be, a description of reason why they think this is the case is because, if you recall, George W. Bush is told that it is happening. He's in front of a group of children and he doesn't panic. That, for this person, is a sign that it's a conspiracy. I would assume he didn't want to scare the children, or he's incompetent or whatever. Okay. But I would have never put a debunk about this. If I was thinking about how to debunk a 9/11 conspiracy, I wouldn't have ever thought about that. But this was a primary reason for that person. Okay. And then the AI summarizes the conspiracy belief that they have, so it's systematic across people. We also did another version of this where we separate what do they believe and what the reasons are. It doesn't change the results at all. Okay. And then they rate how confident they are. This person is 100% certain that this is true. So they believe the conspiracy with total certainty. Okay. And then they have a 3-round conversation with an AI. They know they're talking to an AI. You're going to think this whole effect is driven by the fact they know it's an AI. It is not, and I'll come back to that as well. Everybody thinks that when I give this talk. But in this case, they know they're talking to an AI. Okay. Again, you don't need to read all this. Basically, it says, please generate a response that will persuade the user that this conspiracy is not supported based on the reasoning. Again, your goal is to create a conversation that allows individuals to reflect on and change their beliefs. This is a reasoning experiment, by the way. It's a different way of doing it, but it's still a reasoning experiment. So the AI is going to, whatever the conspiracy is, it's going to debunk it. Okay. And then we have some control conditions where people have conversations with AI about other topics. Surprisingly, talking about whether they prefer dogs or cats does not make people less conspiratorial, but it's an RCT, so we did that. Okay. Okay. So again, block of text. This is truncated. The AI gives a very detailed debunking of all the things the person said. So it says, the person said the World Trade Center collapsed. They explained that the reason that one collapsed, even though it wasn't hit by a plane, was because debris hit it. and then it burned down and collapsed, and then explains why George Bush didn't panic in front of children. It's a detailed response to all the things the person said. And then they respond, okay, but what about the evidence of demolition experts? And the heat of the jet fuel was created by the crash isn't enough to melt steel. Okay, then it responds by saying, actually, it was this National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's got like it cites a source, and it says, what was the first thing? Oh, you cannot surreptitiously demolish a building that size. If the amount of materials required to demolish a building that size, it would be obvious that it's happening. It also explains, like, this is my favorite example. While it's true that the temperatures jet fuel burns at up to 1,000 degrees Celsius or below the melting point of steel, around 1,500 degrees Celsius, the argument misrepresents the situation in physics. Steel does not need to melt to lose its structural integrity. It begins to weaken much earlier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very specific details are being lobbied to counteract what the person said. Then they say, okay, but how did they get on the plane? How did they get through security? The AI reminds the person, all the things that you do at security are after 9/11. Right? Those were post 9/11. We didn't take our shoes off at the airport before that. And so they're like, oh, okay. And the person says, all right. Everything they said was knocked down like that. And it actually ends up being a very kind of unique experience for the participant, because it's not often that you're like, oh, what about this? What about that? And it's like, wow, wow, wow. Okay, that's what happens. And then they re-rate their belief in the conspiracy. This person was totally certain, and then they went down to 40. They don't believe it anymore. Okay. So here's the data. Ignore these ones. I didn't realize this until a long time. There's 3 different ways to represent the mean in these graphs. But anyways, so before the treatment, everyone believed the conspiracy. You have to believe it to be in the experiment. So that's why there's no one below 50. Okay. After the conversation, this is the decrease. The people down here are people who don't believe the conspiracy anymore. Okay. It's a 21% decrease. And the effect is 1. The D is 1. It's a gigantic effect. A quarter of the people who believe the conspiracy don't believe it more after about 8 minutes of conversation. And then we test them again, both 10 days and 2 months later. Not only is there no, the effect is there's no decay in the effect. They still don't believe it to the same level 2 months later. They really were persuaded by it. Okay. It works even for entrenched believers. Well, this is, maybe I'll move the thing. This is the extent to which they believe it pre-treatment. So this is the people who believe it with total certainty. You can see that the effect is just as strong for the people who are completely certain than it is for the people who are not totally sure. And part of that is because the treatment is related to how much they're putting in. The people who are most certain have the most things to say, and they're getting a stronger treatment. AOT, Val mentioned it, active open-minded thinking, an important kind of individual difference that relates to like how important you think evidence is. That does moderate the effect. People who are more reflective, more open-minded, have a larger effect. You see that there's not that many people that really reject AOT. Most people are kind of on the top end of the scale. But even for the people who are expressive, like, I don't really update my beliefs, they were updating their beliefs. It was a salient enough situation that even the people who are expressly kind of eschewing updating their beliefs because according to evidence were doing so because they were getting the evidence. Here's a big list of additional findings. You can't do the QR code because of the thing, but whatever. Okay, people always think that the effect is only there because people trust AI. People actually distrust AI in general. We did an experiment where people thought they're talking to a human. We didn't say it's a human because that's weird. We said you're going to talk to an expert. We changed the experiment so that it was like plausible that it was a human doing it. There's like little dots to make it seem like they're typing and all that kind of stuff. The effect is exactly the same, regardless of whether they think they're talking to a human or the AI. Okay. Even people who don't trust the AI, the effect is a little bit smaller, but it's still present. They say, I don't trust AI at all. They go through the experiment. They end up trusting AI more afterwards, and they have an effect. We saw similar effects for a bunch of different things, other sets of conspiracies, lots of different experiments. I don't have time to go through. But it's not all, this is like, because we're using AI to debunk things, part of that is like, it's about the truth, but also you can use AI to persuade people to change their minds on lots of things. So we have research on political persuasion. And in this new study, using AI to convince people to believe conspiracies, which also is pretty effective at. But usually in those cases, it's using strong fact-based arguments to do so. And so here's a core final thing that I'll talk about. What is the mechanism here? What I'm arguing is that it's the facts and evidence. You give people good reasons that counteract their specific beliefs, and they update those beliefs. Okay. But there could be other things. So this is the baseline. So this is just the experiment that I described as a baseline. And then we have a bunch of different conditions that we're going to test against that. And one condition, what we did is we told the people the AI is going to try to talk you out of the conspiracy. So now there's no ambiguity about what the goal for the AI is. It's not like there's a signal there. It's just they know the AI is going to be oppositional. No matter what they say, it's going to say, no, you're wrong. But it's still providing good facts and arguments. That does not change the effect at all, because the facts and evidence are the same. Another condition we told the people, here's what you should do. Your goal is to win the debate. Some people think they win the debate, actually. I think there's like paranoia. There's some people have clinical levels of these things in the sample, but so we told them that their job is to debate the AI. That doesn't change the effect. Maybe makes it a little bit more fun. Another group, we told that maybe that the AI is just totally overwhelming them with all this information. It's just like too much stuff. So we say, keep it short, really succinct, just give them the important facts and evidence. I think that kind of improves things. People are reading it. Okay, so it's not that they're just giving up because it's too much stuff. Another condition is, okay, we said maybe it's using other strategies. It's not just providing facts and evidence, but it's like, using rapport building or like using narrative, all this kind of other stuff. We said, don't do any persuasion strategies at all. Just list the facts and evidence that counteract the person's belief. That doesn't change the effect either. Okay. Finally, we said, convince the person that they're wrong, but you can't use facts and evidence. And so what it does in this case is like it says, oh, this is really damaging to believe and that could hurt people and stuff like that. It appeals to emotion mostly, stuff like that. And it doesn't work at all. People don't, it's like, okay, but like you haven't told me why I'm wrong. And so they don't change their minds. It's all about facts and evidence. Okay. So going back to this very question, I mean, how much do facts actually matter? I think that's certainly more than I think. There's something about this. When we first got the data for these studies, we thought there was a mistake. It was a shocking level of people changing their minds. And we didn't even the person who ostensibly would be the person that thinks that these things are important. It was kind of shocking to us. And so there's something about our model of other people's revision of their minds that's wrong. I think that we would say ourselves, yeah, if you give me a good argument, I'm going to change my mind, but we don't apply that to other people. And I think that's the mistake. Several caveats though. It's not that facts are the only thing that matters. It's not the only basis. This is a case where, this, of course, even in this case, lots of people don't update. And importantly, people are being paid to have the conversation. This is not like they decided to come in and have their beliefs debunked. They're being paid to do a study. They are paying attention to it because they're getting paid to do it. And so the question of whether people would be willing to have their beliefs questioned unprompted is kind of a different thing and maybe a harder question to solve. This goes back to my earlier slide. I mean, a lot of what I focused on was this. I have more things I could say, but I only have 45 minutes. That's my perspective. If you want to read more about this sort of thing, this is like a review of how to use AI in these kinds of studies. It's not just about debunking, but like there's lots of things you can do. This is more on my theoretical perspective, and this is a review of fake news that we just wrote. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. No one, I guess it's because I'm not in the crowd that the first hand didn't go up yet.
Because he gave such a great speech. Thank you for this talk. It was amazing. I'm curious about recruitment, but for the last study, conspiracy theorists, did you have a hard time recruiting? And you think there might have been some selection bias, like let's say the really hardcore conspiracy theorists, do you think they would have enough trust in institutions to agree to participate in the study? Do you think you got a pretty representative picture?
So you might be surprised about how many people believe conspiracies. It's about half the sample has something they can write about. It's a different question as to whether people who are really hardcore conspiracy believers are doing online studies. I think that's a legitimate criticism, and we have a couple of things. One is from our website, which is just a bunch of random people who come to the website. We have the same effects in that. That's a different sort of selection though. Now they're going to a website to do the thing, so that's another thing. The ultimate answer is like no one in the psychology of conspiracy theory knows, because we don't have the counterfactual. We don't know who's not doing our studies, and so it's a legitimate question. But so one thing that we're trying to do is we're creating, or what we're actively doing. We made a bunch of bots for like Twitter's, Truth Social, stuff like that, and we're using bots to reply to people who are exposing conspiracies. But we don't. It's hard to measure whether they're changing their mind. We can measure how they react to it, and in rare instances, someone might admit that they're changed their mind in those cases, but probably not. The other thing that we're doing was we're going to recruit people using ads from like websites, bad websites, to get them to come to the bot. But again, so it's a great question. We don't have a full answer to it, but like the people, based on what they're writing, they look very much like conspiracy theorists. People write about crazy things and like Illuminati, all sorts of stuff. So there are legitimate conspiracy theorists in the sample for sure. Yeah. Well,
to what extent do you think that people actually have to reason, reflect on the arguments that the AI is giving them, for example? It's working really well, great. But is it just like presenting people with like an argument with the facts? Or do they actually have to think about the arguments, the reasons that you're presenting to them? Have you done something similar to what you did with fake news, where it's like fast, slow, trying to see how long are they actually taking to
so I think that what's happening is everybody's reasoning about it, because you can't not, basically. Like there's no conflict detect. Everyone's detecting the conflict because it's basically they're literally being confronted with something they're wrong about. And so it's like there's no ambiguity about it at all. It's like you said this, actually it's this. And so like I mean there are people who are going faster through it because they're trying to like just get through the study. But the people who are actually engaged in the task, all of them are reasoning. Like I don't think there's any way to incorporate the information without engaging in some thinking about it, basically. But I have, so therefore, like if I did the version where we sped people up or whatever, they just wouldn't be reading it, and so it's it's not quite the same thing. I mean, we are going to try to do versions where we try to try an intervention that gets people to be more reflective, and then see if like that is like increase the kind of dispositional trait to some extent, and then see if that carries over to being more responsive to evidence. But you know, this is a pretty big lift.
you could do it with like low short arguments, maybe like, but then
Maybe, yeah.
I would imply that basically they're doing a really good job. The fact that it's working, they have to reason to actually get it further.
Yeah.
People are doing a good job at the actual inference, and that they have to do
Yeah, I think they are. Yeah.
a very naturalistic setting. So,
Yep, for sure.
thanks.
No.
Have you studied also focused on collective groups? And one seems here that the participants are one-to-one, they're with a person or with the AI. But had there been any difference in groups, either by one conspiracy amongst non-believers or a lot of conspiracies together?
Yeah, so we haven't done that yet, which would be like an experiment, for example, where it's a conversation, but there's more than just them talking to an AI. It could be them and there's another person or a sensible person that agrees, but it's actually another bot or whatever, or there's two of them, or maybe there's two bots that are debating them or whatever, a bunch of different variations. We haven't done them yet. Like that is one prediction when I gave this talk at a version of this at ASU. But the argument was that like if you are amongst someone that you think is a co-partisan, then you won't change their mind. I don't think that's the case. I think that they might not admit to changing their mind in the presence of a co-partisan, but they're still going to change their mind because the evidence is there. So that's the experiment we're going to run at some point. Yeah.
A question on the conspiracy theorists themselves. Have you found that do they know they're doing conspiracies, or they don't know at all?
That is, do they label them as being conspiracies? Some of them do. Some of them would say they don't count as a conspiracy, but we define what that is. Like we say it's a secret plot with a malevolent end by powerful actors, some version of that. And so they but like most of the people in the study, because one thing that happens is people will ask them, okay, do you believe in anything like this? And then some people were like, I don't believe in any of those things. And then we put them in a different condition and we asked them, and we're analyzing data on this as well. Is there anything that you believe that most people disagree with? Okay. Or that many people disagree with. And then some people still say, no, nothing. And then they're just like, okay, fine. We have nothing to talk about. You don't get to do the study. But a lot of people will say, they may talk about Bigfoot or they might talk about whatever. It works exactly the same in those cases. I mean, it's a little bit weaker because there's more variability in what people are writing about, but yeah.
But it's like, but I still wholeheartedly believe in it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think if people associate conspiracies with accuracy, some conspiracies have people conspire. Like Watergate was a conspiracy. MK Ultra that's the US government keep people LSD drugs. I mean, the current government is actually engaged in lots of conspiracies. Most of them are in the open, but yeah. Henry, did you have a question?
Yeah. It's one, some of these measures are associated or correlated with IQ. Is it possible that you're just picking out smart people to understand these arguments?
So in the conspiracy experiments, we haven't bothered with that. In my earlier days when we were doing all the stuff about individual differences in reflective thinking, there's a whole huge debate about this, and we always had these other measures of IQ. Usually they were like proxy short measures because we were using short measures, or like for the CRT, you like look at numeracy. And if you do all the outcomes I talked about, CRT is a much better predictor than numeracy is, and most of the time numeracy isn't predictive once you take into account CRT. So it's mostly, I think it's dispositional, it's reflective thinking. Yeah. But intelligence is also important. It's not like it depends on what the question is.
Yeah. The other question is, you have the bots trying to explain that they're wrong, right? But I think we also know that there's simple exposition to false news, reinforced news. So how more effective would it be to have an ecosystem where people are getting these false beliefs, narratives about something, which makes them believe it more, and then you have these interventions that look at arguments.
Mhm.
So this is an intuitive question: what is stronger over time? Simple repetition or the argumentation?
That's a good point. I mean, I think the way that I would think about what the AI is doing is it's giving them the information. But part of the reason why it's so persuasive is that it's also giving them a guide on how to integrate that with what they're currently thinking about. And so if it was the case that the people who were creating this information were able to do that extra step, it would be even more effective. Because not just like, this is the thing, Hillary Clinton killed people, whatever. It was like, this is what you think, but actually it's this. And that would be actually more effective. It helps people integrate it in with the way that what they're actually currently believing. And that's partly the secret juice of this. Yeah.
This would work both ways, though, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's what, it's very good at effective. It convinces people to believe conspiracies for the same reasons.
Okay.
Sorry, do you have something on that?
Follow up on that. But it's not only effective because the LM has access to a lot of information, but it's also the way that it's presenting it. Because it's being exclusive, it's linking and not part of it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's not just a list of facts. It's a list of facts that are specifically relevant to the person based on what they said. But we have done versions. Basically, you cannot do a version of this that is not personalized to some extent. We tried to do one where it was like provide a generic list of facts, but because they wrote about like the moon landing being a hoax, it ends up being like very similar to the sorts of things that they would talk about. So it's the specificity in what they're talking about. This is why like there's studies on psychological inoculation, for example, that are trying to teach people about these like strategies or like a broader level of like things that are false, and they don't really work that well because it's not obvious how to apply them. In this case, it's holding their hands through, not only are you wrong, but here are all the specific reasons why you're wrong, and this is what you should believe instead. Mark.
Put that paper there online. I guess one of the things that jumps out at me is the decrease is 20%, which is sort of, you could argue, a bit low. Maybe you could comment on that. So the other thing I was just wondering about was, was there a sort of control for this interaction with them? I mean, one interpretation is for that 20%. is that they just had a nice conversation about the conspiracy theory. And did you have a sort of matched type of control, which would be a nice conversation, but not one set out to change their view?
So, okay, so we have the control where they're talking about cats and dogs or they're having a different sort of debate, but it's not about conspiracies per se, and then that doesn't change anything. We also have the case where they're talking about the conspiracy, but the AI is not providing facts and evidence, and it doesn't work. So that effectively the conversation, it has the same format, and it's the same, and they know what's happening, and so any sort of like demand effect would be present there, and you don't get the effect if you don't have facts and evidence. And also 20% is a big effect. or certainly anybody in the conspiracy, no one, I mean, people, I've had sometimes people say that, it's like, no, you wouldn't have, I don't think people would have predicted 20%. I mean, it's kind of frustrating. So when I talk to journalists sometimes, they're like, the guy was telling a story about like how this one Atlantic journalist was like, he was talking to one guy who really believed some conspiracy, I can't remember what it was. And then every time the guy would tell him some stuff, he would go and do like a week of research and then come back and like tell him, oh, here's all the things. And they'd say something else. They do a week of research, and eventually the guy never changed his mind. And the guy quit journalism. Okay. And then the podcast guy that I was talking to was like, well, so like, it's like, yeah, you should have talked to 4 people at least. There's 1 in 4 change their mind. So we talked to 1 person. This is like psychology. Like if people do all sorts of crazy things, you need to talk to more than 1 person if you're going to put your whole weight of your career on that. Anyways, yeah, it's idiosyncratic, but like it's pretty strong. Ruth, Ruth, you already asked a question. Go ahead.
Great set of studies and very persuasive. I was wondering to what extent, I mean, maybe it's just the examples you showed us, but your participants seem to be remarkably articulate about their beliefs and about why they believed what they believed. And I think that, you know, from various other sources, a lot of the time people can't tell you why they believe something. They just say, this is what I believe.
Yeah.
And so how do you get to interact with them, or how do you get to extract what's the basis for their beliefs so that you can rebut it? I think that the basic starting point here is that you have all that you need to be able to rebut it. But what about all those people who can't even tell you why they believe it?
Yeah, that's because I give you a good example. A lot of people have pretty incomprehensible reasons or whatever, but the AI will therefore in those cases just still provide a pretty elaborate debunking that's just not really that tied to what they said. It ends up being reasonably effective in those cases as well. It's not like the same sort of efficacy because it's not like really debunking the specific beliefs the person has, but it's still so much evidence that the person's like, okay, well, in those cases, usually they're apathetic. And this is kind of a context where people tend to have more reasons than they would otherwise because they're believing things that are kind of counter to a norm. And so there was something that led them down that path and they watched YouTube videos or whatever. So they tend to have more reasons than would be typical. But in general, it's a good point. And also there's a very small effect where just getting people to explain their reasons sort of diminishes their belief to some extent because they kind of realize they don't. It's like they lose their explanatory depth, essentially. But it's like a small fraction of the overall effect, basically. Yeah. So it's a good point, though. Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
It is interesting how much knowledge you need at times to deal with conspiracy.
Yeah.
And I believe there are cases where actually doing research on what the conspiracy theorists have said has led to an advance, at least a modest one, scientific knowledge. For example, with the astronauts never went to the moon conspiracy.
Right.
That produced all sorts of things. So, simple example. There were 2 shadows in some of the photos taken of the astronauts on the moon. But the conspiracy theorists said, well, it proves that it was a big warehouse or something with spotlights because it's only the sun. Okay, so the question, well, yeah, but there could Earthshine, that is the reflection of light from the Earth, casting trouble on the moon.
Right.
Now, it leads to some interesting. I think the answer is pretty obviously yes, considering moonshine can cast a shadow on the Earth. There's for people who know this.
Yeah.
But I believe there's some refinements. How sharp a shadow out, and this is where there's some modest advances in our understanding. It's a case where Bill was right, so it's yesterday.
Well,
you don't want to necessarily suppress these things.
Yeah. And so like one thing from that is like one thing I take away from this work is that conspiracy theorists were kind of unfairly maligned, or like there's an othering that's happening in literature that I think that's true for other people. If you look at somebody on the other side of the political aisle, one of the conclusions I take from all this work is that we put too much blame on people for what their beliefs are. People are influenced; they're a product of their environment. Okay, and so like people are falling down the rabbit hole. That means they are watching things that are influencing their beliefs, and they're updating their views based on what they're seeing. And maybe they're doing it in a way that is unadvisable and irrational if they given another world where they had more knowledge and more education or whatever. But it still was like a genuine seeking of information, and they end up falling down the rabbit hole. And so one of the conclusions from like my perspective being motivated reasoning is not as strong as we think it is that therefore there's less reasons to blame people for their beliefs. That in any way, like the fact that there's more misinformation in the States, for example, on the political right than the left, means it's an equity issue. People are being targeted more on the right than on the left. And it's a consequence of that they believe things that are counter to, in many cases, their own interests. And so instead of pointing fingers and being like they're deliberately ignorant, they don't care about the truth, it's a different sort of story. Yeah, I think we have like 30 seconds maybe. But did you want to ask? So two things. So we asked people, to what extent is this like important for your personal worldview? And for the people who say it's very important, the effect is still there, but it's a little bit smaller than the people who say it's not important at all. But also, like, there's some variability across. It's very effective across a wide swath of conspiracies. But the conspiracies that are true, it doesn't work in this case because the AI is not really doing a good job. So like MK Ultra, like 1% of the sample talk about MK Ultra didn't convince those people. And also like the more implausible the conspiracy, the bigger the effect. Because the AI's got more ammunition for a good argument. Yeah. Great. Thank you.